I'm lying in bed on a wintry night and there's a big storm brewing outside and there's lots of rain and thrashing around up here on the mountain. And I'm thinking about my father and I'm thinking about his death and how we never really had a warning. Apparently, there was a couple of warnings, but I never knew about them till my father suicided. And I'm talking about it because I don't want it to be a taboo subject anymore. I don't want to have it as a subject that people brush away and say that, they're sorry he's passed away and was he old and was he ill and had he had a stroke and all this. I know people mean well, and I'm not so sure if there is a right way to handle it, and we all grieve differently, which makes it all much harder for people to try and be present and useful and helpful in a scenario like this. But I just wanted to bring some fundamental truths to the table. So, yes, my father had a stroke. I was there for his stroke too. Um, was he old? I guess it's all relative to your age and what's old, isn't it? Oh, was he ill? No. Clearly, he was ill emotionally. I'm not willing to concede that anyone who thinks of suicide as an option is a happy person. I do not believe that. Um, I've had people say in my presence that they were lucid and of sound mind, some people, when they make choices to suicide. And I'm going to argue that. I guess I can't speak for every single person, but I don't believe that anyone that is in an emotional state of being that is not in a happy space is lucid and in sound mind. Because while no one can be happy all the time, we can make an effort to be happy most of the time. And I think when we have the right support network, we are more aware of the fact that we can get back to the happy space at some time. But when you are contemplating suicide in its full gravity enough to actually do it, I don't think that you're a sound mind and I don't think that you're happy. You're either in a lot of pain physically or emotionally or both. And I think my father was in a lot of pain emotionally and I think physically too. It played a part. I'm very sorry. I haven't been sleeping very well. Um, and this isn't all based on my own experience. I made a suicide attempt years ago. I was a teenager and I was at school and I had something pretty abhorrent happen in my life and I try to process it and come to terms with it and I try to move on in my life and for a period of time I could. But the triggers were there and the scars were there and they came back and haunted me quite a lot. And because I was at a young and impressionable age, I really had no life experience to be able to understand how to support it. Excuse me, and I didn't have a stable support network in my family in the way I needed at the time. And that's not to fault them, I'm just saying nobody in my family knew how to deal with it. I'd been raped when I was a very young teen, and it made mincemeat out of my head. I just couldn't think clearly, and I made some choices very blindly because I didn't know what this meant for my life as it was, and I was in a terrible space emotionally. I couldn't cognitively think. I couldn't put one foot in front of another and have the confidence to feel like things would change or could be okay ever in my life again, because I was in such a dark space. And I suspect that for a lot of people, particularly when they're young, that they struggle to come to terms with these things, because not because people don't want to be there or because they're not consciously trying to be there, but because they don't know how to, because they're not in that person's head. They're not in their heart space. They don't understand. So there's a bit of give and take on both sides. So when you are going through all those dark things, I encourage, one, for us to ask things, to make that talk of, are you okay? Or in what way do you need me to be there for you? Or can I just sit quietly there by you? Or, and the other side is also for the person that's feeling suicidal to be able to reach out and to talk with someone about it. And I don't know that family members or friends or partners are always the best people to talk with either, because we can try and be there in that particular moment and say all the right things even, but you know, if your friend comes up or your partner comes up and says to you that they're feeling suicidal, there's all sorts of entities that can come out of that conversation, in that you might say things at that crucial moment in the right way, but in the next flippant moment you may get it wrong because you're emotionally invested. And so when you're speaking to somebody who's a professional, there is a time frame that you're allotting all those thoughts. You're condensing all that pain into that time frame. You tell them how you feel, and that professional person can be not detached emotionally, but they're not attached to you emotionally. They wouldn't bring built-in guilt into the table of why you should hang around. They wouldn't bring any of their own emotional baggage that is attached to you into that picture. It would just be about you. If you're feeling suicidal, it would just be about you. It's about making time for you. And when you're feeling suicidal, you deserve and you're worthy of that time from that person, uninterrupted or undistracted by anything else. I hope I'm making sense. So with my father, we can all sit there and hold grudges against ourselves and feel guilty, which in a lot of respects I hold a lot of extraordinary amounts of guilt. For a variety of reasons. But I think the biggest thing I hold for my father is this really, really tangible, deep-hearted sadness that that I couldn't have loved him in a better way. I don't mean to keep him alive, because that's a choice that he has to make for himself. But that I couldn't have those deep, open conversations with him. Because there's so much political correctness in my family that, or among some of my family, that it's difficult to just bare your soul and to be affected and emotional and sensitive and hurting without being susceptible to being targeted for it. And my father was one of those people who I think struggled to be vulnerable and fragile and open with that fragility. He was one of those men that felt like he needed to be this different persona and, be strong and aloof and hold it together and carry the weight and be a father and very, very masculine and dominant and everything. But the sad and most unforgivable thing is that he never got an opportunity to be this beautiful, soft, awkward, clumsy, gentle boy that he was under all these layers. And that if he had have been those things and he could have connected with that part of himself and celebrated those vulnerabilities and that softness inside of his heart, I think he would have been a far more resilient person, because he would have allowed himself that heart space and would have made it more available for him to have sharing in that space with us as his family, so we could have been open about the way we felt. And when he said, when he was going through hard times, perhaps it would have been easier for my father to say, I'm really struggling right now, and I need to ask you to be accountable and be present with me when I'm struggling, and take me down to the river, or just hug me for a little while, instead of being stiff upper lip and no, I'm fine and I can deal with it. It's a real masculine entity that is inbred in so many people, particularly in past generations. But that's not the only reason why people suicide, and I guess I'm still doing as many do. When you suicide, you try and make sense out of it. You try and grasp onto it, and you try and make sense out of it, and you break it down into a million pieces, and then you forget where the pieces go back together again to make the picture up that you started with. So every time you put it together, it's like a whole different jigsaw puzzle of abstract pieces. I can hear during the course of this conversation that I still have a long way to go to be able to get my shit together. But then I also feel during this conversation that I've also come an extremely long way, because as those who have been present in my life since my father's suicide will be aware of, until a few days ago, I couldn't even string a sentence together cognitively and effectively. I was just very gappy in my thoughts, and it's not that I was distracted, I just wasn't present. I would just cry, or I don't even know actually. There's a lot of gaps in my memory with it. If you have, or if you are going through suicide, or if you're feeling suicidal, or if you're trying to understand how to be present with someone who is suicidal or who's going through the grieving process, what I can invite you to do is to ask them if they're okay, to hold them if they'll let you hold them, to be present with them. Don't walk out on them in the hardest time. I had people that did that, who I really needed close to me, and I called one of them about it. I called him up about it, and he knows who I'm talking about. But I didn't do it to hurt him. I did it because he hurt me, and you can't do that. You can't be there present for someone's best and then dump them when they're at their lowest. And by dump, I mean you can't. Please don't just cut. Don't be just leave them swinging when they're in the worst time of their lives. It's a really shabby thing to do, and it's a very narcissistic behavior to just leave someone when they're in the most vulnerable. I really was pretty close to suiciding myself, which I know nobody really wants to hear. But I was pretty close to that myself, and I don't think that I was the only one in the family that felt like that. It's a dark space that you end up in, and it's like an abyss, and you're down the bottom of the abyss looking up, and it's not like you're even looking for someone to hand you a rope ladder to get back up. But it would be helpful to know that that is an option that may be worth following up on, and people that are around you are there to remind you that that is an option. If they just walk past and ignore you, like this person, for example, did, then they really are initiating that suicide for you. So it's pretty cruel. I've joined up with a couple of sites that I think are useful sites to move forward, and I'm pretty determined to do something to break these taboos and to try and reach out to people to find different ways outside of suicide, and also for those of us that are trying to come to terms with it. So this is the day one of it, is just making sense. Sometimes that's all you got to do, and you can't really make that much sense out of something that doesn't make sense. But what you can do is make sense out of how you feel by just talking it out, or by writing it out, by painting it out, by going to get professional help, by meditating and letting those things come to the surface until they just keep going through. It's kind of like a picture of a forest where you go, the only way out is through it. And it's kind of like that when you're going through grieving. Sometimes you have to wear it so long that you're tired. If you're tired, you sleep. If you wake up in the morning and all you do is get up at some point of the day, even just to switch the kettle on, it's okay, it's a win, it's a start. So I thank God that you made it that far. Everything is step by step. And the next part of this process is to practice self-care, which I'm coming up to. So this is day one of recording this and bringing it out. So if you have anything to add to it, you want to talk about your own experiences to do with feeling suicidal, or someone that's suicidal in your life that left an impact in your life, or how you feel about it in a conversation. You may feel like suicide is a cop-out, that's for cowards. My father did. My father had that conversation with me when I was a teenager, and he wasn't particularly proud that I had made an effort to kill myself. And his mantra throughout our whole lives, attached to our surname, was that we never, ever, ever give up. It was his mantra for his own life that he upheld and followed on to us, that we must never, ever give up. And it was a great positive reinforcement. I'm not sure if it was born out of my suicide attempt or if it was always there actually. But he certainly meant it, and so it was so against the grain for him to suicide. So he got a car and he made his last meal and had the respect to drive it out to a vacant lot so that he wouldn't impose on anyone, particularly my beautiful sister and her husband. I really don't feel like he had any intention to hurt my beautiful sister and her gorgeous husband by killing himself, which is why he took himself to such a very different space, so that he wouldn't put it in their face, he wouldn't put them through the misery of finding him. He didn't want to involve anyone, and I think furthermore, he also didn't want to be present in a place where anyone could possibly stop him. His mind had been made up. It was clearly a very, one could almost say, cohesive mindset. And I don't think it was a lucid, balanced mindset that he had at that particular time. But I think his decision to do it was that he was in too much pain, too much misery to continue in his life. And that misery could have been born out of the fact that my mother had died several years before that. And I know that they really did have a fairy tale love. And so it was hard for him to be on his own without her, and had done so many amazing things in his life. And there he was on his own, and he had had a stroke, which had compromised his independence. He was surrounded by COVID and lockdown. COVID this and COVID that, and fucking news on all the time. And there's many reasons why he did what he did. It wasn't going to get better. He was going to end up in a nursing home. All we can do is guess, but there are some things that are really obvious about why he would have chosen to die. And I don't believe any of them had to do with anyone else. So no one else really can blame themselves, because if we feel like we are responsible for his deaths, then that's also saying that we are accountable for not keeping him alive. And I know that when I was killing myself, I took an overdose of tablets. And I was pretty ill. And I also tried slashing my wrist. But when you're doing things like that, you're not in a sound mind. You're in this dark, horrible pit. You don't believe that there is a way out of this mindset. You're stuck in it. You feel like you're useless or you're bad news for everyone around you. I think everyone has a slightly different take on why they do it or how they're feeling, but it all comes down to a negative mindset. You're in a space where you don't want to live anymore, and you don't want to bring that pain to other people. You can't make sense out of the life you're living because it's tormenting you for some reason. And so when people go, oh, I should have known, or I could have stopped them or whatever, what were you going to do? You were going to be present for that one moment to stop them, and they were going to stop because they felt guilty. They felt like they owed you to live another day. But it has to really come from where you are at within yourself to want to live. And that's something that we don't look at enough. So it's about all I've got energy to say tonight. I hope some of it makes sense.